I'm interested in knowing how that text strikes people, and also the American worker, and then the Lefort, text, which is, directly inspired by James and the James group. The American worker was, translated in French and Italian almost immediately. I don't know if people had, time to read the supplementary stuff, but the Stephen Hastings King is an excellent work on the kind of history of workers' organization. So workers' inquiry as a concept. What do people think? Want to talk about the James? Notes on dialectics?
Yep. Jasper, I think you're right. This odd combination of this Vatic text that's crazy, but seems to be generative too. It's hard to consider Hegel a sort of admissions requirement for either understanding Marx or, divining the proper strategy in the moment for the left. That seems to have been left behind in the period when people were looking for a specifically Hegelian method that distinguished it from bourgeois science, but it also seems to have been very generative among the group at the Johnston Forest thing. I mean, I think the workers' inquiry, the Paul Romano piece, is just incredible. I thought also Assad's genealogy of the workers' inquiries and so forth, where they talk about the Romano text as being a testimony, not strictly speaking a scientific inquiry, but having a huge suggestive effect and mobilizing effect, was very, very interesting. So,
can I chime in here? Yeah, I'm curious, just like, let's take a temperature of the room if I can. How many people do feel like Hegel is still important, and how many people feel like we have left that behind, as I understood you to be saying, like the idea that we need Hegel to understand Marx? Because I think there's some dividing lines there. There certainly are people. I think my understanding is Althusser insisted you could just get rid of the first chapter of Capital because it's too Hegelian. And
can I reframe what I said? I think reading Hegel
sure.
is really important, but it's not an admissions ticket for doing it. I think every time you read Hegel, it also, opens avenues in Marx that are not there. And I read Hegel a lot, but I wouldn't suggest that you have to do it to sort of get Marx at all, or so forth. So I'm not on the Althusserian anti-Hegel thing or the Deleuzian anti-Hegel. I'm a Hegelian, card-carrying Hegelian, and I read it for pleasure. And I'm sure it has a great effect on my understanding of the left and Marx, but I don't think I'm going to be discerning the telos of history as I read it, or understanding what stage is coming next, or understanding something about that bourgeois science can't get. That's all. I mean, I use Hegel differently, but I don't want to discourage.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. I still think there's interesting, variety of perspectives, at least in our in-person version of this a few weeks ago in Oakland. There were people who considered themselves Marxist Hegelians, and not even just Hegelian Marxists. And then there were people like Hegel is a bunch of BS. So I would be curious to hear if there are other people that feel like chiming in about that.
Can I just make some observations? I really like the CLR James text and hadn't read it before. And I guess that there's kind of this Hegelian emphasis because of Lenin's own thought. And I felt this general spirit of it is how can we return to the kind of ground of permanent critique, as Lenin did throughout a series of texts that he wrote, and particularly in his critique of the Second International and Trotsky and so forth. So what I thought was interesting is that there were a lot of resonances in this text with that I recognize from people like Piven and Cloward's Poor People's organizations, movements text, where they're kind of critiquing gradualism and kind of the national character of certain types of socialism, and how so like it's kind of like this regrounding of how to relink intellectual and the struggle and the cooperation of intellectuals and workers. So, I mean, I think in like when we're talking about workers' inquiry as well, is that a lot of it is the kind of springboard for it is Marx's critique of Feuerbach, and that's where he does break with a kind of more Hegelian or a kind of traditional Hegelianism.
Can you say a little bit more on that last point of connecting it to the critique of Feuerbach?
Yeah, so in the 12 Theses, there's the line about the educated must be educated, and that how in order to have like a full to a kind of grounded materialism, that what would it be? It would be like that not only are men made by their conditions, they also make their own conditions. Therefore, there's a kind of a mutual conditioning of means and ends, and then so therefore there's this question of, and this comes up in the Le Four about objectives and subjective conditions, and what Marx identifies within the proletariat is that the two poles are like connected, and intersubjectivity would be like kind of the bonds of solidarity and so forth would be something to do with that. So the making of their, they're created by their economic conditions, but yet have the potential to overthrow those and abolish those conditions.
Thanks. That's helpful.
One question that I had as someone who has not read any Hegel would be, do you need to read Hegel to understand the James piece about Hegel and Marx? Like, because he was using I think he was using like capital S substance and some of the other, there were like a lot of like capital letter words that I think are coming directly from Hegel that are like, the terms that he was using and trying to use that method to understand their current situation. And I'm curious if anyone wanted to give like a backgrounder on like how those words are used in Hegel. Maybe that would be like a helpful way to think through the claims that James is making, perhaps, for those of us that haven't read Hegel. Or if that's like not necessary and like not the right angle, then we don't have to do that either.
You're muted, Jasper.
You're muted. Some people are having trouble
I'm
hearing.
certainly not capable of doing that. And my sense is that, it's like if we want to understand Hegel or Hegel's relationship to Marx, there's like 50 other texts we would read aside from this one. And that this one isn't really about either of those things. It's more about using Hegel to kind of periodize and make a series of kind of generative claims about the nature of kind of history and the sort of status of organization. And Hegel's categories may be interesting in understanding James, but I don't think that they're really interesting in understanding Hegel or Marx, and that like, it's really sort of sui generis. And and I think it's this text to me is most interesting when it's making specific claims, and the rest of it seems to be just like a way of kind of getting to the point of saying things like there is no more important organization and the party is done and this is why. And but again, I'm not really that. I'm not a Hegelian. I'm not a good reader of Hegel. I'm actually scared of Hegel. I think it kind of like sort of like ruins your brain in some way. I mean, it doesn't always, but I feel like I'm really scared of the kind of effect that I see Hegel have on Marxists in a way. And so but I do think that it's, of course, useful to understand. You can't understand Marx without understanding something of what Hegel has, how he appears in Marx, but there's really lots of texts you can read that will do that pretty well for you. And this isn't one of them. But I think that there's actually really something to what James is saying, and I would like to, and I'm going to try to support it today in some weird way. And I think I understand what he means by Hegel in a sense, which is, the kind of sort of identity of both, theoretical and theoretical work and the kind of workers' movement itself, the ultimate identity, of transformations in the nature of kind of thought and representation and the workers' movement itself. And so that becomes, in in the theme of workers' inquiry is almost like, the subject that would kind of, be able to kind of objectify itself and actualize itself in communism. I'm sure I'm making a vulgar, a mess of Hegel and saying and using those categories, but the actual is communism. Obviously, everyone recognizes that. Like when he talks about the actual, and the absolute, that would be if you're going to be like do a communist version of Hegel. That's the stuff that is the end. But maybe you want to do it, Phil.
No, I wouldn't be a good person to give a short précis of Hegel. It's too scattered and unmediated in my mind to do it. But I will say, though, I think that the new frontier in Hegel is to read Hegel through Marx rather than to reading Marx through Hegel, which people did in the old days. And that's very interesting when one reads Hegel with Marx's capital in mind as well. We do have, what I will do is we do have a read May. We read, this was not the logic, but the phenomenology 2 or 3 years ago. And we did have a sort of bibliography with commentary that we made that I'll post on the board if anybody wants to look through it. Yeah.
That'd be cool.
Yuvia said that she's willing to try to explain Hegel in Ray CLR.
Hi. I mean, it sounds like quite esoteric every time anyone attempts to like discuss Hegel. But I think it to me it kind of provides a taxonomic even like I mean I was introduced mainly to Hegel's work and what he wrote on aesthetics, and since that is my background, I felt like it was very clear and very I suppose like enlightening, and then I started to like just absorb more on his writing and his influence on Marx, and also have like read what Althusser said as a as part of the dialectic, to see what's the antagonistic position on the subject. And so the first two elements that I would just like break down, it's for Marx, after the like embracing of materialism, he still maintained the dialectical approach in the sense that what defines something is at times like that which would be the opposite form, so like by like similarity and distinction. And what he in the Grundrisse, he starts mentioning that he assumed that the opposite of production would be consumption, but he realized that the opposite of production in this mode of production has an actual obstruction, which is a mediation that is artificial, and that is circulation, or the distribution that capital in which it intervenes, right? Like that we don't really need that in a society like that is only or solely producing for use value. We would not require this mediation. And then after that, he started to perceive that this mode of production, once removing all the like categories that appear as the main substance or form, it was possible to perceive the moments of capitalism. So to him, and in the Grundrisse, he mentions that, I think he describes through identity and non-identity of the moments. And that's a very, like, I think, beautiful way that he described it, like the moments of capital, like the whole circuit, and what constitutes the production, consumption, and that moment of like circulation and distribution which are like artificial and which create the entire circuit, but that we could resign from. So just like little just little summary.
Where do you see that in the CLR James text, though? I mean, that makes sense as in terms of Hegel's influence on Marx, but do you see that in the CLR James? Do you see, I mean, I certainly, you know, the non-identity of any, you know, the fact that you discover, when you examine something, you discover its opposite certainly seems to be, I mean, that method seems present, but where do you see that sort of structure in the text?
I feel like the concept of like subject, essence, and the opposites, and I guess like he was trying to examine the antagonistic forces of such and trying to identify them in the like history of multiple movements and organization. So in that sense, I felt like it was like I agree to a point, but I don't really agree with Lenin's reading of Hegel so entirely. So I would defer there.
It seems that what we can say about the James text is that if it's Hegelian, but it's not necessarily like imminent critique as we expect from Marx and Marxists. It doesn't start with this kind of small kind of category and then explode it and work its way out. In fact, it starts from the other side. It kind of starts from the end, assumes its conclusions, and then uses that method to like tell us that as bad as things look, they're actually really great. And so it just seems very different than Marx or Adorno or any of those like Hegelians that we would, I don't know. I'm not, you know, but I think it's, yeah. And that may be Hegel too, you know, I think that probably is Hegel, you know, but, you know, I don't know.
I think like the danger with the like employment of such categories and forms relies on not bringing it back to the material conditions, and that could be a trap in itself. Like
right. But what I will say, but this comes out of an intense engagement with material conditions and what he saw in class struggle. And even though he's not very clear about what he is reacting to, you know, if you know James's biography, he had seen during World War II, this kind of wave of wildcat strikes and kind of spontaneous organization. And he believed that there was this kind of subterranean revolutionary potential that was, you know, kind of brimming with consciousness and knowledge of its own task, and that the reification of the Communist Party and you know the labor movement overall was actually just, you know, sort of surface, and that below it there was this like wellspring. And you know, and who's to say he was wrong, you know what I mean? And it's a very unique moment in which, because of partisanization, especially in other countries, you know, the Communist Party was just massive and filled with every kind of Yahoo. And it was kind of like, it was a bit more like the DSA in the sense of just this, even though it had this like leadership that was Stalinist, you know, just everybody was in it. So maybe it made sense. Like you could just think like, we don't need to form a dual union or another thing. It's already here. And as I said, that kind of that perspective that, you know, there is this subterranean current of kind of working class action that, you know, you need to pay attention to. I mean, it's probably impossible to overstate the influence of that move by James. And it's actually quite unique. It doesn't come from the communist left of Germany. It's totally sui generis to James, I believe. And I mean, you know, there's similar things, but inquiry is not a thing for the Dutch German communist left at all. In fact, because, you know, they're concerned with like very specific revolutionary tasks. And I don't think, and I think actually James didn't use the term inquiry, and that's not really even what he's up to, but yeah.
My reading of this is probably colored by the fact that I've been reading Richard Lewontin and Richard Levin's The Dialectical Biologist recently, which is like totally different. It's like, it's a, you know, these are like, but it is totally Hegelian. Like they're talking about contradictions and opposing forces lying at the base of like the evolving physical and biological world, and
Yeah.
and they were defending of like a kind of neo-Hegelian you know, science take that was distinct from bourgeois science. And these people were like not just crackpots. Like Lewontin, you know, invented electrophoresis. They were like some of the he was one of the founders of like molecular biology. And anyway, some of it does kind of resonate. Like I mean, I don't know Hegel well enough, but you know, some of his claim about organization, it comes from a kind of holistic like view of everything being, you know, parts and wholes being interpenetrated by each other and things turning into their opposite, and this sort of thing that I don't know. I do have the sense that well, I mean, I have a growing sense that modern complexity theory, complexity science, is kind of like a new version of Hegelianism, maybe a better one in certain respects. But that like Engels talking about the dialectic of nature, and Marx like trying to grope for things in Hegelian terms was, and you could say even the same, like you've said, Jasper, like Rosa Luxemburg was also kind of talking, it's almost like complexity science kind of talk, the way she talks about the revolt in 1905.
And it's deeply modeled on evolution, right? The big thing she's responding to is evolutionary socialism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think there's a lot of people that are working in that direction. I don't know much about it, and I don't ultimately know what I think about it. I would have to know more about Hegel, I guess. But I think that you're right, that's a lot of people are kind of moving in that direction of some kind of new materialist Hegelian thing that makes a place for Marx, but it's also, I think, beyond Marx, really. You know, it's yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, just to mention it, it's also a wing of bourgeois economics or neoclassical economics has moved on to both complexity theory to try to save marginalism, and also evolutionary economics.
Right.
Those are things you read that try to extend and preserve the notion that we're starting from markets is the right place to start, but we need to factor in complexity, or we need to factor in evolution and so forth.
Right. Neither of which are particularly
It's not necessarily a Hegelian move that leads to something, you know, either left or Marxist or.
No, but I think there's an attempt to reconcile that with Hegel by a smaller group. I don't mean to say that complexity is by any means Hegelian. I think it's actually at its core really not in some way. It's like, but yeah.
I mean,
I have
so another thing, you know, the question is, how did, obviously, what James looked around and saw was sort of amazing because nobody else was seeing it at the time. It was sort of possibilities or contradictions that looked below the surface. So the question is, did he register this empirically, or is there something that his Hegelian method made visible when he applied it to the things around him? I certainly think that Hegel reading Hegel makes us much more conscious of contradiction, of constant change and becoming, as opposed to kind of static categories and stasis. But then I resist the notion that there is a particular method that if you apply it to reality, called the Hegelian method, you know, this simplistic notion years ago of stagism using Hegel to get from thesis to antithesis to synthesis, which is not, of course, words that Hegel doesn't use. But in other words, all I'm trying to say is, I think your question is very good. I mean, how did this theoretical thing enable James's incredible vision as to all of these latent possibilities that are around looking at these movements and so forth, that the time of organization is over. Everybody knows it. And the next thing is to sort of move into these things. That's
Yeah. There's a great bit in Paul Beulah's biography of CLR James, which I didn't put up on the thing, but it tells you what he was doing when he wrote this. And in fact, he was driving, he was, I think, in California, and he drove to Reno in order to divorce his first wife so that he could, marry Constance, that was the woman that he had met. And, so you just have to imagine him in kind of Reno, holed up in a motel waiting for his divorce to go through, writing this thing on the United States. It's quite funny the way that Paul Beulah tells the story.
Where is that Beulah description?
He wrote a whole book about CLR James. It's essentially a biography. It's called CLR James. I have it here.
Uh-oh, Jasper's never going to come back from his library trip.
I'm sorry, I can't locate it. I'm not going to look too long. Yeah, my things are just too disorganized. So I had been thinking about the question that I raised last time, and this kind of idea of this kind of speculative scenario. And it turns out that in some ways that actually brought me to the Lauren Goldner piece that we looked at last time on the Spanish Civil War. And this very interesting moment at the end of it, when he talks about the need for an inventory, right? And he actually describes this as part of this Hegel-Marx method. So the Hegel question is not going away. So, when I asked last time, is it time to form the fucking Soviets? Obviously, it's not. But if it were, one thing that we would want to do is to create a kind of thoroughgoing accounting of the subjective and objective bases of such Soviets. You would want to know who there is and what there is, and who's down and who's not. And that's, of course, a task that in some way or another most revolutionary groups do. They try to figure out what things are. It might be helpful if that work had been completed in advance. And the people had already begun the kind of work of trying to know these things. Although in some sense, I think, and this is maybe what Hegel tells us, such a process of accounting could only be the revolution itself. Let's just say the full accounting can only be once you mobilize everybody to kind of participate in this kind of inventory and to register it in a reflexive manner. But here's how Lauren Goldner describes it. He says, our method is different. So it's method. We begin precisely from an inventory. We begin precisely from an inventory of world material production and, above all, the material reproduction of those who are engaged in it. We include in that the reproduction of nature, such as climate change, the solution to which, like the distribution of world resources, necessarily and obviously points beyond any localist solutions, such as those which often held back the industrial and agrarian collectives in Spain. This is the concrete totality of the Hegel-Marx method acting upon itself in the reproduction of the world, starting with the reproduction of labor power. Right? We look at the concrete struggles of this labor power in contradiction with itself, that is capital, from the Marikana miners in South Africa to the 120,000 incidents, strikes, riots, confrontations over land confiscation a year in China, to the gas and water wars against privatization in Bolivia, to the strikes and riots in Greece against European union austerity, to the militant attempts of Egyptian workers to find a path independent of both the Islamists and the military, to the mobilization of public employees in Wisconsin, Ohio, or Indiana against assaults on their wages and benefits. Most of these upsurges, often quite impressive, are actions of the class in itself, however militant on the way to becoming a class for itself, namely ready to pose an alternative social order based on a self-recognition that their protagonists, once aware of their tasks, are the incipient alternative. we seek in them clues to the future convergence of class for itself, as, for example, the growing recognition among transport workers of their special power in shutting down choke points, one Achilles heel of globalization. I highlight this notion of inventory because I want to argue that it has its roots in the idea of workers' inquiry, which we are set to discuss today, we already discussed, and which is central to the story of the revival of council communism after 1945. Indeed, workers' inquiry, and perhaps inquiry more broadly, is the bailiwick of the communist left. There's a whole history of very interesting groups traceable to the impetus given by CLR James's Johnson Forest tendency, who have effectively made inquiry the basis for organization as such, or at least organization before the establishment of the Soviets. Contemporary groups such as Chuang, Angry Workers, or Hard Crackers, in my view, the creme de la creme of communist groups in the Anglosphere all share in this common, though by no means very clear history, and have some relation to the project of inquiry. Indeed, Lauren Goldner's call for inventory is one version of her proposal I've heard whispered about, but never seriously undertaken for a very long time, the production of a pre-revolutionary, and this is my term, kind of Wikipedia of reproduction, which might gather specific information about the location, distribution, and operation of useful capitals and capacities, which will become the organic and inorganic body of those Soviets. If we want to be prepared to dismantle the nuclear reactors, then it behooves us to speak to the nuclear engineers, to gather the blueprints, and to understand such a thing could be done and who would do it. This is one way I've heard this thought phrased. Perhaps I like this because as an early childhood reader of science fiction, Isaac Asimov's foundation idea lodged itself in my developing mind. An important question that communists must ask each other, and to which answers will not be easily forthcoming, is what resources exist where I live? What do people do for work here? How much of it would be useful for constructing communism? How much useless? How much of it would be potentially orphaned by the international production system? Of course, we can't simply enumerate, we also need to speculate, to theorize. A recent essay by Nick Chavez, a communist engineer, written for the Brooklyn Rail, contains these questions very specifically and proposes some distinctions about which types of resources could be reconfigured to the tasks of communism. Every inventory will also be an inventory of potentialities and therefore speculative fiction, a fiction hoping to become actual. And that's because you take over not just the factories, but the kind of capacities and possibilities they contain. You don't simply reproduce them as they were. There's always imagination kind of embedded in any accounting. To do so requires not just the enumeration of capacities, but potentialities constructed therefrom. Indeed, one might imagine that a task for such an inventory would be the production of narratives of possible outcomes. Sorry, my printer keeps turning on. It's being annoying. Okay, so indeed, one might imagine that a task for such an inventory would be the production of narratives of possible outcomes, from a Wikipedia of reproduction to communist choose your own adventure. This narrative dimension is unavoidable because a revolution is not a system. It's not a database. It's not an Excel spreadsheet, but a movement in time. A concept closely related to inquiry within council communism is correspondence. Correspondence and council are linked early on, as there was a KPD journal essentially Spartacus from before the split of the KPD, called the kind of Communist Council Correspondence. I can't find any information on the adoption of this term, and perhaps those who read in German can help here, but it seems to me that we might intuit that correspondence is to council as newspaper party. That's to say, the council has seized on this idea of correspondence as a not necessarily unidirectional form of communication, unlike the newspaper. If the newspaper was the fundamental organ of the mass party, explicitly theorized as such by Lenin, in which professional revolutionaries would educate via writers and editors the masses, councilor emphasis on self-organization required something less unidirectional, modeled on the call and response of epistle, correspondence, and debate. This makes sense if, following the New Institute for Social Research, who write in a really excellent essay on the council idea, if we understand the council less as a particular form or content, then, and this is their words, essentially self-reflexive responsivity to natural and social conditions in the process of their collective transformation. by individuals. And I'll read that again. Essentially, self-reflexive responsivity to natural and social conditions in the process of their collective transformation by individual. And that's a very nice kind of abstract, and I think in some ways Hegelian way of thinking of the council form, which need not be the council necessarily as we think of it. As partisans of the KAPD and the AAU and the AAUD regroup in the late 1920s, clarifying and refining their theory of the workers' councils, the chief fruit of which will appear in Jan Appel's Grundprinzipien, they increasingly adopt the term correspondence for their output. The Dutch GIK published Rate Correspondence in German, which reprinted articles from and was reprinted in Paul Mattick's International Correspondence Committee. Intriguingly, Mattick had not at this time given up his sense that a party was necessary, now to go back to the kind of debates from last time, putting it at odds with some of the members of the GIK who had arrived at a strict theory of unitary organization. In 1931, he wrote for Rate Correspondence this lucid statement about the relationship between party, union, and council. He said the party organizes all consistent revolutionaries, even those of bourgeois origin, who join us. It regroups all revolutionary forces which do not base themselves on the place of work. It is organized by place of habitation. It is more a military or propagandist organization, although the one cannot exclude the other. It declares itself unreservedly for the AAU, that is, for the elimination of the party during the seizure of power by the councils. Until this moment, the party fulfills the function of shock troops. Here, this makes Appel's catalytic theory of the party explicit. The party is the catalytic element which allows for the formation of councils through the union of expropriated property in the factory groups. Here he clearly has in mind the armed groups of KAPD. The party is an amplifier, propagandistic, but it is mostly a negator, running interference or blocking tackles. Nonetheless, the emphasis on the essential tactical autonomy of these groups of fully formed communists means that a unidirectional structure makes no sense. In the topsy-turvy of the March action, the gap between Holtz's armed group and the striking Leuna workers, unaware of the existence of the other, could not be newspapered over. It could only be overcome by correspondence, by a dialectical communication. Newspapers are good for amplification. The first acts of the revolution functioned through the structure of amplification. An essential part of the Spartacist uprising was a battle for control over the main newspaper of the workers' movement. But newspapers do not organize because they are not reflexive. Remember what Appel tells us, except maybe in some long, timeline. It was wrong of the KAPD to issue a proclamation in its papers calling off the doomed offensive action which it had begun to organize to attack the trains supplying the Polish army in its fight against the Red Army. Even though it was doomed, the party can only promote such a call or fall silent. That is because reorganization, a change of plans, can only be effective if it's self-organized, dialectical, reciprocal. Otherwise, it is only disorganizing. The strategy of the KAPD was a strategy of lateralization, immediation. The purpose of the factory groups and armed groups was to create direct linkages, correspondences between the workers' workplaces to break the mediation of the trade unions, the state. When interest in council communism revives after World War II, chiefly through the defection of the international Trotskyist movement's best and brightest after Trotsky's death, it takes up the concept of correspondence. CLR James and Skaya's Johnson Forest tendency rebrands itself as the Correspondence Republishing Committee after 1948, and they leave Trotskyism. And Socialisme ou Barbarie, founded after Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort left the Fourth International, gives birth eventually to Information et Liaison Ouvrière in 1958, and then Information et Correspondance Ouvrière in 1962, and finally Échange et Mouvement. And the last two groups built around Armstrong's novel ideas about inquiry as organization and organization as inquiry. The influence of what we might call the inquiry correspondence complex on the larger structure of the ultra-left cannot be overstated, as nearly all significant journals and projects, from Endnotes to Trong to Angry Workers to the various communist summer camps, have some relation to this notion of organization as and through inquiry, especially if you're broad enough to include it as kind of inquiry into struggle itself and kind of reports on the nature of class struggle, which is in some way a kind of primary orientation of this. And you can see it in Lauren Background's kind of naming of significant struggles to which, militants are encouraged to attend and pay attention and to kind of map and understand. Communization theory emerges as the self-criticism of this process of inquiry, correspondence, organization, while Mattick's conception of the party as shock troop is preserved in texts like the one published above Lauren Goldner's Insurgent Notes. There's largely a refusal of formalization within the milieu, and what groups exist are hardly parties, or rather they are informal parties, part of the historical party, not organized by sanction and vouch, and for the most part articulated from the practical organizing work their participants do, and that's not true entirely. Mattick's ICC was formed from the small group of US proletarians he could interest in Council Communism and with whom he organized in the early years of the Depression, but he found there was a complicated trade-off between correspondence, committee, and publication. Only with an increase in the number of readers, this is Mattick reflecting on the history of ICC, only with an increase in the number of readers, which coincided with a membership decline in the group, did it become both possible and necessary to print the journal. In view of the reduced membership, however, it was clear that Council Correspondence did not promote the growth of the organization, was practically no more than a vehicle for the elucidations of the ideas of Council Communism. A successful publication might not be a successful group, in other words, and vice versa. This trade-off is very much recognized by those who inherit the concept of workers' inquiry from the Correspondence Publishing Committee. As Stephen Hastings King makes clear in his excellent study of workers' inquiry on Socialisme ou Barbarie, the French were tremendously inspired by the example of the Americans, but also struggled to implement it in the context of their work with the workers' newspaper, Tribune Ouvrière, which was distributed throughout the auto plant at Billancourt, then the largest factory in France and one of the largest in the world. In part, the problems of application derived from their different historical contexts, which were not just differences in space, but also time. The mid-1950s was a very different context in the immediate post-war period, and arguably called for different methods, which would have to be invented, not imported. And so, I mean, I think that's a real important difference in these two texts that James is written in, right during this kind of, when this post-war strike wave is still, happening, and when he had a lot of optimism about the potential of revolution. By the mid-1950s, I think no one thought like that. And so it was just a different time, at least until the 60s. I included two texts from the JFT and Correspondence Publishing Committee by CLR James, because I think they speak to James's optimism about the communist horizon circa 1948 or 1951. James, like Bordiga and many others, expected a revolutionary upsurge to follow the conclusion of World War II, and he had reason to think that he was seeing the beginning of it. The period was considerably less settled than now thought, and saw a massive strike wave, the largest ever, which built upon the wartime wildcat organizing, which had helped James to rethink his ideas about class struggle. James's insistence on notes on dialectic, that there is nothing more to organize, must be seen in this context. He rejected the idea of forming new parties or dual revolutionary unions, factory groups, etc., because what he saw was a working class which stayed in the Stalinist parties and unions, but simply rejected its leadership, using its front groups and social clubs and arms for its own end. He felt he had reason to believe, therefore, that if one simply disorganized these institutions, that the revolutionary rank and file would transform them. One can't understand this position without understanding the status of the world communist parties at war's end. The Popular Front had massively increased the popularity of the communists, who were central to the resistance, and the parties were swelled with members. Within that conjuncture, it might make sense to adopt such a vision of spontaneous de-Stalinization, a process that James thought would invariably also involve class struggle in the USSR as well. The projects of inquiry which the Correspondence Group undertook, such as the American Workers, were not designated as such. And in fact, the term is an imputation given to this tradition after it was taken up by the writers associated with Quaderni Rossi, Operaismo, and its afterlives, particularly Romano Alquati and Sergio Bologna. In the context of a proletarian offensive, however, inquiry wasn't the objective so much for James as the testing of a hypothesis about proletarian consciousness. Neither Phil Singer or Grace Lee Boggs are systematic in their approach. Rather, Singer looks for confirmation of his own experiences. He looks for correspondences between his own revolutionary perspective and the actions and expressions of the workers he encounters. This is not to disparage the work, which really needs no superlatives from me, since the fact that it was translated in French and Italian immediately and imitated by some of the finest communists of the time is recommendation enough. With Lefort's essay and the reception of these ideas within Socialisme ou Barbarie, one sees something different. If for James the key term is consciousness, for Lefort it's experience. James's philosophical sources are in Hegel, Lefort's in the left phenomenology and hermeneutics of Les Temps Modernes, where he wrote and he knew Merleau-Ponty, and where there was a kind of debate about Leninism and the Communist Party. James is concerned with what's objective and consciousness, Lefort with what's tacit. In a less revolutionary moment, legitimate inquiry is called for. They need to figure out where people are at. Lefort is also thoughtful about the form or the grammar of inquiry itself. If it is to be truly a workers' inquiry and not a workplace inquiry of the sort already trailblazed by American institutional psychology, then it will have to be inquiry by the workers themselves and not simply a report about them. This is more than a matter of worker writing, but of worker research or co-research, to use the term invented by the Italians. Workers must be involved in formulating questions and not just answers. And why stop there? Workers must also be involved in deciding on the form and distribution of the output of that research. Since the point for Lefort is not simply to produce knowledge as such, he is a phenomenologist and recognizes that all knowledge is embodied, embedded. The point of an act of worker writing, as he says, is another act of worker writing, a response, a correspondence. The content of such a project must itself be emancipatory. We are well beyond something that could be bound within the pages of a book or even stored within and displayed by the ramifying cells of the internet. But we are also well beyond something that can necessarily be embarked on by a group of proletarian intellectuals. Inquiry in this sense would have to be the form of self-knowledge of an entire movement, a position it arguably achieved or began to achieve in the case of Italy in the 1970s, whose movements place an enormous emphasis on what Steve Wright calls in his new book, The Weight of the Printed Word, that is to say, on the form and content of proletarian organization through language. Where does that leave us, other than with little time remaining? It seems to me, I hope it is obvious, that the project of communist inquiry is enormously important, necessary even. Revolutions will have to produce these inventories the easy or the hard way, or they will be failed revolutions. But what kind of inquiry? Reports on struggles or tactics and strategies, investigations into proletarian consciousness or experience, concrete assessments of dead and living workers near and far to be emancipated by communism? Yes. This is where James's Hegel and Lauren Goldner's Hegel-Marx method seems relevant. Not that I really know anything about Hegel. The process of expropriating capital and abolishing classes involves also the appropriation of the knowledge that attends that capital, not in some simple way, but in a way that transforms that knowledge and what can be known. An inventory is not a blueprint for communism, but rather a means by which communism becomes actual. So the actual kind of progress and completion of that inquiry would be its kind of actualization in a kind of fully actualized communism. And so I will leave it there, and hopefully we will too someday. And I'm interested to hear kind of what people think. It's a lot. I'm kind of riffing and bringing things together, and it's written for you guys who've been here all along and paid attention to the other things. So.
Is that text viewable? I don't know whether that got shared on
No, I haven't shared it yet.
That would definitely help me to digest
it's a little wet and wild. I don't know if I want to put
I like it wet and wild.
Yeah, I know.
It would help me too. It was a lot to take in with you reading it, and your audio was kind of garbled a little bit too.
Okay. I mean, it's 3,000 words. I can just, put it in the chat or whatever.
Plop it in the chat.
I think it is available on the workers on that long document after all the listing.
No,
One
no,
day.
this is new. This is a new text.
Okay. Well, some of it I recognize from the stuff
Yeah.
below.
I mean, basically, I'm saying that James and Lefort are doing something really different that has to do with their intellectual sources, and that also has to do with the historical moment in which they wrote, and that needs to be understood. And then I'm saying that, James is kind of like, for all the difficulty in understanding how to make sense of a book like Notes on Dialectics now, the influence of that is hard to overstate. And essentially, the rebirth accounts of communism almost wouldn't happen without it, or it's hard to imagine it. It's actually hard to imagine the SI. It's hard to imagine so many other things without these kinds of weird ideas. But then they took on a life of their own. They changed. They were problematized. And arguably have found their fullest expression in Italy in the 70s, where they ran up against problems. It was not like it was a kind of successful thing. And I think that's an important story. And in some sense, it made me realize that, inquiry is really what all these ultra-left groups kind of share, that they put inquiry as such is the form of organization. And, it made me think of this idea that I've heard for a long time, which is that we need an inventory of where we are. Maybe kind of workplace inquiry is only one aspect of what would need to be done, which is a kind of understanding what is out there, kind of technical assessment. And that is also going to need to be a subjective assessment, and who's down and who's a revolutionary. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And I think there is something Hegelian about it, even if I don't really know anything about Hegel. And so maybe James is right after all.
Yeah, I like this idea of the inventory of, can we say something like the state of consciousness of a movement or something like that in all of its parts? Maybe that's too airy, but
right. But I want to say that's just one aspect, right? There's the consciousness mapping and the struggle mapping, but then there's also the kind of objective assessment of capitals.
Yeah, and maybe also the resources that struggle has assembled, like its infrastructures, or
yeah, totally.
like an inventory of tactics, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And people do that work all the time. It's the best writing, and the sites that do it, like Ill Will and other that are really attend to contemporary struggle, are so valuable.
Yeah, that's like one attraction to Commie Camp, of like a kind of like show and tell, and then the discussion that can happen in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this notion of correspondence, because I think it's quite interesting. And it comes up in through various examples of people who are like groups that are interested in workers' inquiry and counter-communism. And I think it's kind of implicit in Marx's original 1880 workers' inquiry, in that he asks respondents to provide their names and addresses. I think that the hope, it's astonishingly unsuccessful survey, because no one replied. But he clearly has the hope that groups of workers will begin correspondence with each other. And this idea is actually taken up by Sojourner Truth Organization as well, in that they hope to become a mediating institution between intellectuals, revolutionaries, and the force of insurgency from below, which they kind of both see in the sphere of social reproduction and at the point of production among Black workers and other groups in the late 60s who are like clearly not white workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I was hoping, I was actually, I had also thought maybe that Chloe Cooper, who's been attending the meetings, could kind of present on Noel Ignatieff and Sojourner Truth Organization and the kind of influence of this idea, down to like hard crackers today, because it's, there's a thread that goes all the way back to James, in the sense of that, somebody also reminded me that Marx had a communist correspondence group in the 1840s that was like, one of the precursors to the Communist League, right? Was they used the term correspondence. So I think you're right that it's like its roots are in Marx.
Hey, can you repeat or expand a little bit on what you were saying about correspondences to council as newspaper is to party? Jasper?
Well, I mean, I think that, some Leninist groups put the party, put the newspaper at the center. I mean, obviously, like Lenin's What Is to Be Done, links party and newspaper. And I think in a way that isn't really explicitly theorized when the groups in the 1930s kind of back away from the idea of a directive or educative party, and they call themselves correspondence groups. There's something to that in the sense that it's insisting on the necessity of the kind of reflexive character of correspondence and the need for, the kind of root of that thing to actually be not the publication itself, but the kind of consciousness of workers themselves, right? It's like that's the base, and the newspaper is just a kind of expression of it, which is almost, different way of looking at it than that kind of, sort of instrumental. And of course, Lenin's ideas of the newspaper aren't strictly instrumental, and it's more complicated. And certainly, newspapers do allow some reflexivity, and I'm sure the Leninists could correspond that he had this idea about the pluralistic party and yada yada yada. Okay, so we can do that, but I think that there is something different about that conception of the party around this kind of model of correspondence, which is really connected to what Appel is saying in that text, and you can see how Mattick kind of hones right in on it.
Cool, thanks.
I was just going to add, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but you see a lot of the focus on the newspaper and the sort of using that as a basis for a shifting party relationship in Tronti's work too, like in the 70s in Italy, or even earlier than that, in the Party and the Factory. And a lot of this comes out of Andrea Anastasi's new translations of The Weapon of Organization, but he talks a lot about that stuff, and that Tronti's focus on the newspaper was less like a way for the party to tell the workers what to do or whatever, but more about just trying to connect the workers to each other, and then also use the newspaper as a way for workers to explain what they wanted the party to do for them.
Yeah.
I just wanted to introduce, to expand the notion of workers' inquiry and historic experiments as a way of preparing for a more multi-platformed research in the future, as opposed to just words, written stuff, and so forth. There was a strike in Besançon in 1968, which is textile workers, one of the first factory occupations in France since the 30s. The workers asked Chris Marker to come down and make movies about it. They asked Godard to do it, and Marker and Godard said, "We'll give you cameras and we'll come down every weekend for 8 weeks and teach you how to use them and how to make films, and then you guys can make the films." And that was the origin of something called the Medvedkin Group, which made 13 films and was an homage to a cine train in the 30s in Russia, where Medvedkin took a complete photo lab and studio around on trains to various factories and collective farms and had people made films. That seems to me that should be part of the history, because I think it would suggest in the future that whatever form research and inventory, it would be a kind of multi-platform form, as opposed to the kind of workers' written inventory, or written thing, version 3.0 or something. So I just throw that into the mix.
That's super interesting. I definitely want to know more about that group and their input.
Should we take a stack? I think Mike had a question about Grace Lee Boggs. And I mean, there's a lot of questions if you want to jump in. And I mean, as I understand it, Grace Lee Boggs is the Hegel expert, and I think that she was the one who read German, so I think a lot of James's understanding of Hegel was gleaned through conversations with her. And then I mean, she's a hugely important figure in kind of taking these ideas and as in the history of Detroit activism, I think the Boggses are sort of like they were at the center of everything that happened in that city for decades.
Thank you. Thanks. I wanted to mention if we want to relate, since they're like quite different like articles and essays and like different periods as well. I think that a commonality or a common pattern that I found in all is like they really relate to, I mean, they like seem to juxtapose dialectically to concepts, like two very like prevalent themes, like the notes on dialectics. I think it is spontaneity and organization as like opposing forces and antithetical, but also like how do they correspond to the overall unity necessary for the abolition of like the capital and labor relation. And I think that's like something that he seems to be struggling to like identify. And he says, truth in our analysis that all emancipation of labor can only be achieved when it contains and overcomes its complete penetration by its inherent antagonism, the capital relation. And in the Laporte, I think was it it seems to be like the concrete and the abstract, right? Like the like how do we reconcile the historic and the like empirical or experiential? How do we not like prevent the mythology of the workers' movement, and how do we like recollect and like and create an analysis afterwards? Like how do we even examine? And I think it's like those opposing forces that are like in contention. And then the Henry workers supplemental work also, like I felt like that was really interesting because it's the opposition, or like the tension between the organized syndicalist approach versus the like more spontaneous like insurrectionary form of struggle, and also the perception of like a fixed a stagnant perception of the labor movement versus the well the populations that are made surplus and that are functioning within the informal or para-official labor. And lastly, I think I really enjoyed the text by, I think Nick, right? And also the one Jasper shared on insurrection and production. I feel like to assess the notion of like technical knowledge, and if we were to transcend and overcome the division of labor, like the what would technical skill within the production process signify, right? I feel like that was with the low mix, I don't know, like the low volume production processes and in the industrial process. I feel like that tension was quite dialectical and it was excellent.
I will say that Insurrection and Production, I had read it maybe like a year or two ago for the first time, and in some deep way, it probably actually was the inspiration for my piece that I'm going to talk about here later. There's some obvious parallels between them, but I take a bit of a different angle than they do. Yeah.
Do we have anything else in the stack? I think maybe potentially you could just go, Nick. I mean, it's almost a kind of a natural transition, unless there's something anybody wanted to say, and then we can have Nick go after that. All right, I guess it's time to hear from you, Nick, and I'm really excited and just talk about your article.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I've prepared some notes for myself here. I'll just summarize kind of the main points, the kind of main arguments I make. And then I guess if there's time, I can take like a short Q&A afterwards if there's, time permitting. But yeah, so for those of you who haven't read it, I have a piece that came out in the December-January edition of Field Notes on the Brooklyn Rail called Technical Expertise and Communist Production. And so the idea was to kind of talk about a lot of my kind of just things I've observed, because I'm a mechanical engineer. So my day job is I do mechanical engineering of different kinds. And so I noticed that a lot of discussion around production done by communists is typically done by people who, for largely structural reasons, are rather removed from the productive process and are good at kind of dancing around all these like abstract categories when talking about production, but don't really seem to have much of an idea of how that kind of manifests more concretely in the actual productive processes themselves. And so the goal of this essay was to kind of bring some categories from the engineering realm to bear here, but with a obviously Marxist kind of bent to them in a way that might make it easier for people to talk about these things in a less abstract fashion, in a way that's actually kind of more concretely meaningful. Because there's between abstraction and concrete analysis, there's something can get lost if your abstractions are not too much linked to what's actually happening. So that's the goal here. And I guess it's up to you guys to decide how well I do that. But before I get into talking about the actual technical categories, I kind of want to tell people about the kind of idea behind the essay here is, the ultimate goal here is communism. That's what we want, right? It's important to know like what exactly is communism and like what differentiates it from capitalism. How do my categories kind of, work with that sort of that movement there? And so obviously, if we're talking about communism, it's a society where goods are produced for human well-being directly and not mediated by some kind of intermediary, like any kind of intermediate abstraction, such as value, as it is under capitalism. And so, in a different piece that I have on my site, I make the argument that you can look at things in terms of all kinds of competing efficiencies, like whether it's labor time efficiency or whether it's like carbon emission efficiency or noise levels or really anything you want. You can now rationally consider these things against each other. You're not just strictly subject to structuring your production around, exchange value. And so I'll kind of get back to that in a bit, but first I want to talk a bit about these categories. And so I talk about, there's two main styles of production that I talk about in my essay. And the first is low mix, high volume, and then the second is high mix, low volume. And it's given that each one is 4 words that sound very similar, they're just in a different order. I have a habit of sometimes mixing them up when I talk about them. So apologies in advance if I say something that's a little nonsensical. Feel free to just correct it in your head. So low mix, high volume, what these words mix and volume mean are pretty much exactly how they sound. Volume literally just refers to the volume of things produced. Are you producing a small volume of items or a high volume of items? And then mix is the diversity of items that you are producing or processing. So a low mix, high volume situation, this is what people typically, when you think of the words mass manufacturing, this is typically what people are referring to. The idea that you're producing basically like one item or like a very small, like closely related family of items. And you're making a huge quantity of them, and you have your productive process set up to be amenable to that. And what that means is really important because a lot of the texture, or a lot of the texts and literature on rationalization of labor that you find dating back, of course, to Marx, but then even since then, people like Braverman and his name's escaping me. It's on the tip of my tongue. The guy who wrote Forces of Production, David Noble, that guy. You know, a lot of these guys who write on, a lot of these people who write on this kind of system, usually they're talking about this kind of like mass manufacturing sort of dynamic, because this is where it's most prevalent. But not all production really is done exactly that way, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. But for low mix, high volume, again, low diversity of parts, high volume of production. The name of the game, this is where your labor rationalization takes its most pure form. And you have the idea is minimization of variability. If you're producing a large variety of objects, you want to make it so that you have as little variability between them as possible. And the best way to do that is to minimize the sources of variation that can come in during the labor process. And you know, those sources of variability can sometimes be mechanical, electrical, but oftentimes they just come in through operator. You know, the fact that humans are not machines, we can't just do repeated motions over and over and over again, like like the way a machine can. And so the point of this like extreme labor rationalization in low mix, high volume situations is to basically strip away decision-making power from the workers that are actually working these machines, these high volume production machines. And the way that's done is by making it so that these machines, all the configuration for these machines is done by a very small core elite group of workers who are usually manufacturing or industrial engineers. And then sometimes you'll have some very high level technicians who will have an input in that, things like machine programmers and things like that. But then the point is that you have a small group of people where all the expertise is concentrated to actually set up the machines and keep them running. And this includes things like, you know, not only designing the specific tooling that's made for these processes, but also monitoring production lines, performing QA and QC, ensuring that repeatability is actually being maintained over the course of the production line's lifetime. And then the majority of workers who are on it, who are, you know, the less decision-making power they have, the less like ability to introduce variability they have, the better for profit. And they, of course, you know, get less of an exposure to expertise, or chances to gain expertise, I should say. Now, you know, human beings, we're creative beings. We get to, you could put a human being in a very terrible situation, and they'd still find something to learn or still find something to kind of mentally gain out of it. But the unfortunate reality is that if you're a line operator, you know, pushing the same button over and over and over again all day, sure, you're going to learn some stuff, but it's nowhere close to as much as you would get to learn in a high mix, low volume situation, which again, I'll talk about in a bit. So it's a very extreme form of expertise stratification. You know, and that comes with all sorts of pay discrepancies and everything. But the important thing to note here is that, and I alluded to this earlier, is that the machinery that gets used for this kind of mass manufacturing, low mix, high volume style is usually done in such a way that it's configured to only do this one type of part or closely related family of parts. You can't really. And the reason for that is because if it's only capable of doing this one thing, that reduces potential variability, and it's very easy to then operate it to do that one thing. And I'll talk about what that means for the communist prospect later on. But some examples of low mix, high volume production are things like a lot of semiconductor device manufacturing are typically done in very high volumes. Plastic injection molding is a very, very prototypical example. High volume disposable medical device assembly, that's often done in a very like automated low mix, high volume fashion. And a lot of food processing is also done that way. There's obviously a ton of different production or goods that are produced in this style. The list would be endless or seemingly endless. And so on the other end of this is high mix, low volume production. And this is, you'll see similarities between the two, but of course it's a very different style of production. And this is a style of production that I think a lot of people who don't work near production lines or who aren't in engineering don't really have they think that a lot of people don't seem to realize how prevalent this style of manufacturing is. I don't have numbers in front of me to back this up, but my intuition tells me that it's at least as common in terms of like number of people employed as low mix, high volume is, maybe even more in some regions. But the idea is that, high mix, you're producing a lot of different types of things. And then low volume is typically, smaller volumes. You don't have to, what this means basically is that you're not getting the kind of economy of scale that you would with a kind of fixed purpose machinery that you would with the kind of mass manufacturing situation. And so the variability inherent to doing lots of different kinds of parts or processes requires workers who are cognitively equipped to handle this kind of variability. And so, and you're still going to have a labor expertise stratification, very much so. There's still, a division between engineers and technicians and operators. There's that still definitely exists, but the important aspect here is that people who are kind of at the higher end of the stratification are going to have a much better access to the low level productive knowledge that people at the lower end of the productive stratification get. And then vice versa. If you're at the lower end, you have to, in order to do your job well, you have to learn a lot in order to account for all the variability of different parts that are coming in that you have to make. And, that means how to configure the machine differently to set it up so that you can produce these different kind of things, or, dealing with if something doesn't work right on the machine, knowing why it is that way, or, and as you get more and more experience, you start to see what kind of physical designs of parts are more amenable to being produced on what kind of machine and why, and what the results are and how that affects things like precision and quality and things of that nature. And so some examples of that are like machine shops are like a very good example. Operators who have to use like a mill or a lathe. Now, granted, there's been a lot to de-skill them, a lot of efforts through the use of NC and CNC technology. David Noble, his book is specifically about the history of that. I disagree with him on some of his larger claims, but as far as a history of how that all went down, it's an unparalleled book. I highly recommend it. A 3D printer farm, so someone who has to maintain a farm of 3D printers that's printing stuff out. That's an example of high mix, low volume production. An engineering testing house. Sometimes there's facilities where you need to test. You need to stress test something or perform like a shipping stress test on something. There's places that'll do all of that for you, and they have to be able to get any kind of thing that needs testing and come up with an experiment that'll satisfy the needs of the designers, and then they're capable of executing it. And then like manual welding, it's like a weld shop. A lot of that's not done robotically, requires a lot of just kind of hands-on know-how and expertise. And so the fact that there's low mix, high volume, and the fact that there's high mix, low volume, kind of begs the question a little, like, what about high mix, high volume, and what about low mix, low volume? And these are not really that important, in my opinion. High mix, high volume is usually a situation where you just have a bunch of a combination of low mix, high volume and high mix, low volume lines working in tandem to produce one larger thing, like automobile fabrication is usually a mix of both kinds. So it's a bunch of smaller production lines in a trench coat on each other's shoulders, usually. And then low mix, low volume, not really, I mean, they technically exist, but they're not really big players in global manufacturing. Examples would be people selling little crafts on Etsy, maybe, or people running a little business out of their garage where they produce one specific thing. In areas that are less industrially developed, both historically and I think concurrently, there's sometimes you'll have kind of take home handicraft production sort of jobs for people who may assemble simple things like simple electronics, or may do some kind of just simple device assembly at home, or little clothing, textile stuff at home, and they're making one thing in low volumes, but sometimes it's cheaper that way when there's a lack of factory infrastructure. But I'm not really an expert on that, so I can't say much more than what I just said. Before I talk about what the importance of all this is and why I'm droning on about it, are there any quick questions I can answer before I move forward? I see in the chat, Fidel Costco, you were asking about NC and CNC. That's numerical control. It up,
yeah.
And CNC is computerized numerical control.
Thanks. Yeah, great. Okay. Numerical control without a computer looks like what? or maybe this is too far off topic.
It's I mean, it used to be, it was technically always like sort of computerized. I guess it depends how you define computers, but things like punch cards and all that kind of stuff that the people used before I was born. So
Got it. Thanks.
yeah. Yeah, so I've never used NC. I've only ever used CNC.
Right. There's a
so-
historical development from one to the other. Okay, got it. Thanks.
Exactly, no problem. But yeah, so like, you know, well, why is all this important? Like, what does it matter? And the point here is that, and Jasper alluded to this quite well. I mean, he didn't allude to it, he just explicitly said it, but you know, the building of a communist society is contingent upon the actual expertise of you know, industrial production to make, you know, to reconfigure our productive apparatus away from a capitalist one towards a communist one. Personally, I'm not very sympathetic to the type of people who argue that if you just, you know, you just go to the factory and there's a big switch, you just turn from capitalism to communism. I don't think it really works that way. I think those people have a misunderstanding of how production actually works. Production itself is, it's not just producing these neutral goods that then get used in a specific social context. You have, you know, the social context is what determines not only what goods are produced, but also how those goods are produced. And so if we want a communist society, it's important that we, you know, we understand what's actually the root of capitalism, and how do we dissolve that and then build up a communist society that is, you know, categorically not capitalist and or any other undesirable configuration. And so in order for that to happen, you need the technical expertise of people who make this current society possible. And there's two kind of angles to this. There's the stopping of capitalist production. But, you know, if you just shut down all of industrial production, billions of people are going to die, and you won't have a very successful communism, of course. You know, the idea is to then build up something that in the productive vacuum can then actually meet the needs that capitalism is, maybe not perfectly, but currently meets for people, in such a way that, you know, has its own internal immanent logic that's able to kind of proliferate itself. I had a lot of kind of abstract sort of hand waving towards what I was starting to call counter subsumption, but Paul Mattick, being the diligent editor that he is, said no one wants to read this and axed all of it. And so maybe in another piece I can bloviate about that. But the idea is that so for stopping capitalist production, this is something that you actually don't really need people's expertise for, because there's not necessarily like a creative deployment of building new things. You know, I vaguely remember a piece in Endnotes 3 written by somebody whose name I can't remember, that talks a lot about you know, logistics and you know, the communist prospect inherent to you know, logistics work, or rather the way that logistics work can be a okay, I'll write about counter subsumption. Point taken. I'm just noticing the chat. But yeah, so I mean, Jasper's piece in Endnotes 3 is a phenomenal piece that talks about the role of logistics work in potentially putting a stop to communist production, but also, of course, you know, the way that capitalism has its strategies around that, blah blah blah. I'm sure you've all read it. But so those choke points in the circulatory realm, those are important. But then there's also part of that is our choke points in the productive realm, and so. If you're producing, so the type of choke points that there are where you want to stop production are typically going to be these like mass manufacturing, low mix, high volume sites. And these are the more production that happens downstream from these sites, the better it's going to, you know, the more it's going to put a wrench into the gears of capitalism. So if you have like some kind of semiconductor factory where you're making a lot of like very foundational little microchips that go into like everything else, if you can stop that factory, because sometimes there's like sometimes literally just one factory that'll supply like the majority of the planet for a specific good. I mean, you know, during the pandemic, we saw, you know, the stopping of a lot of semiconductor factories, mostly in Taiwan, but also in China. It just completely wrecked all sorts of other wacky industries that a lot of people didn't know were connected, like the automobile industry. And so, whereas, for example, like let's say you have like a colossal, like I use the example of a sex toy manufacturing facility. You know, you could put a stop to that, but, you know, sex toys aren't an input into other productive processes. So you're not going to it's not going to stop as many things. I mean, it'll stop the circulation of some money, but it's not going to stop the circulation of a lot of actual capital in the form of material inputs. Yes, reproductive processes, maybe. Maybe you can put a stop to that. Good one. But but here's the important part. You can stop capitalism in any number of ways, but how do you start communism? And so, given that this group is a little bit more sympathetic to the kind of communization notions than most people I talk to, I'm glad you guys, there won't be too much pushback at the idea of that. To actually have, install communism, it's not just like political control, it's going to be, you want to actually start building up this little like internal kernel of communism that has its own internal logic. And so in order for that to happen, we have to think kind of what's the actual context of this kind of thing going down. Revolution itself, like a revolution in the productive sphere, that's has a strong social component to it, like a social revolution aspect. How does that actually interface with the productive realm? So in my essay, I have a little speculative tale that I'm not going to recount here, but I encourage you guys to read it if you want to know a bit more about how that might look concretely. But the idea is, if you have a small isolated geographic area, you're probably not going to be able to do much mass manufacturing. In order to do a lot of high volume production, you need a lot of material inputs that you're probably just going to completely lose access to very quickly. And even if you magically had like all the inputs to make a bajillion of this one tiny little microchip or whatever, or like a very specific plastic component, what do you need that many of them for? You're not going to need like a bajillion of, like the outer casing of a Fitbit, like you don't need like 500 million of that little plastic piece on the outside of it or whatever for your nascent communist society. It's just useless. Whereas, if you look at high mix, low volume production, like if you look at a machine shop or a 3D printer farm, or even a small run injection molding site, for example, you can make all kinds of different things based off the demand that this nascent communist society is assuredly going to be having. And it's going to be a very diverse demand that's going to fluctuate very rapidly. That's going to require a lot of different things made by a lot of different types of processes. And so the point here is that the types of high volume facilities would probably, in my opinion, remain mostly dormant or probably get like ripped apart, and then the useful machines taken to sites where you can do this more variable kind of process. And I guess you could say the point is that you really need to be able to, so the kind of under capitalism, you have this big, for these high mix, low volume facilities, there's very much like a variable, like turbulent demand just inherent to capitalist markets. And so with these, this kind of situation is really not that dissimilar from what you might encounter in a communist revolution of this kind that I'm describing, where you have, big variability of demand and everything, and you have to make do with kind of more limited material inputs to make like a big diversity of things. Like, a machine shop, if you just give them a bunch of metal stock, they can, in theory, manufacture infinite varieties of components that are, within the operating parameters of those machines. And that's the critical part here. It's the machines of the machine shop, or the 3D printer farm, or the forge, or any number of these types of high mix, low volume facilities with the expertise that runs them. They're well equipped to handle this kind of diversity, because you don't have to, it doesn't take a bunch of time and effort and expertise to retool all their machines. Whereas, if you have like a very high volume production line for like a specific medical device, although you have tons of machines and fixed capital in there, but you can't really reconfigure it to do something else with it, and still have it be like the same production line. At best, you can just kind of rip it apart and do other stuff with it. So this is the kind of, so focusing on this kind of like creative redeployment of flexible technical expertise and flexible machinery is, in my opinion, very important for any kind of nascent communist society. And I mean, like very, very nascent. This is like, when like the modern Paris Commune type of situation. But then, let's say there's some success and things start to grow. You start to encompass more areas and everything. The point of production will be will begin to shift away from being purely about just the proliferation of this revolutionary spread, and increasingly more and more towards the sustaining and the reproduction of this now like mini society that you have that is continually growing. And that's the important part. It always has to grow. It doesn't have to immediately be global. That's impossible, but it has to never stop and then begun to be like shrunken down. It has to always be growing and continually appropriating. And that's kind of that's part of the kind of like rational, like communist kernel that is like kind of the mirror image of the value form, in my opinion. It's like that's kind of like its own imminent form of unfolding, I guess you could call it. And so, but at the final end of this, you have like, full-blown communist society, capitalism is gone, we won, the world's great, we love it, we're having a good time, we're working 2 hours a week, it rules. At this point, you don't have to worry about spreading the revolution, it's already been spread. At this point, you just, all your production is geared and oriented towards the simple reproduction of communist society itself. And at that point, you would probably have a reintroduction of a lot of mass manufacturing processes, in my opinion. This is where, there's a lot of controversial disagreements between different people on this kind of thing. A lot of old school communists from, maybe like 100 years ago, Lenin's a good example, were of the opinion that mass manufacturing was kind of creating a sort of proletarian discipline that was like Taylorism was actually had like a socialist utility, that if you just like push Taylorism into its logical extreme and you just Taylorize the entirety of society, you can have communism. And I disagree. I completely disagree with that. But he wasn't completely wrong in the sense that you do need a lot of high volume production processes, because it's labor efficiency that makes communism possible in the first place. Like having technology that makes it so we're not just doomed to do very highly intensive, localized, medieval forms of production. That's what actually. It's not that communism was a good idea that nobody had until we had industrial capitalism. It's that it wasn't possible until probably sometime last century. And so as this kind of nascent society grows from being a little Paris Commune to up to a global society, you would probably be able to reintroduce more and more of that of mass production. And the point of that is that like the reason you want that is because there's some goods that they don't make sense to do in a high mix, low volume style if you don't have to do them that way. Like for example, like little microchips or whatever. The process for making like 200 of certain semiconductor devices is the same process as making like 2 million of them. The only difference is time and materials required. So why would you ever make why does every little city need their own little, factory where they each like artisanally make MOSFETs or whatever? You just don't. It's completely nonsensical and a waste of everybody's time. It makes more sense to do them in a more centralized fashion. There's political control questions that go into that, of course. And that's where I throw my hands up and I say, whoa, I'm not a utopian. I'm just speculating, man, like cut me a break. But I think you can all see what I'm getting at here. And so there's all sorts of speculation that can be done about how all this would work. And that's something that it's a bit out of the scope of what we're talking about here. But I think people should be doing that. But being able to talk about how production would work at this kind of dichotomy of high mix, low volume and low mix, high volume is, I think, critical to understanding how, revolution would need to undertake itself and how it would actually manage to spread and not simply just reproduce capitalism with, red flags and hammers and sickles on it. We want something that's actually different, not just has the political appearance of being different. So that's kind of the long and short of my essay. I see the chat's been going wild while I wasn't looking. Does anyone have any questions I can answer? I'm reading the chat, catching up.
Yeah, I guess. Well, I can't wait to read your essay. This is super fascinating. Yeah, there's this question that kind of dovetails, and you sort of brought this up and alluded to it from questions that Jasper brings up in the logistics essay and notes of like, is there some kind of sweet spot that's imaginable or plannable or whatever between ripping everything apart because it's how, there's this question of how much has been made, not just for profit, but specifically to regulate workers' controls over the process and dispossess them of input, control, security, all of those things, expertise, knowledge. So yeah, I wonder what that process would look like. It sounds like you've kind of thought about like some kinds of economies of scale or economies of change, maybe like how much needs to be repurposed, what that transition looks like, whether that's rapid or gradual. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a question, but it's something that got me thinking about.
No, I think it's I mean, yeah, I think you're bringing up, you're touching on something very important. And so the reality, in my opinion, I mean, while I'm not like I definitely wouldn't categorize myself as anything approaching a primitivist or anything, but there's a lot of industrial production you can just probably completely shut down overnight and humanity would be like totally okay. I think that's actually a really important point of any communist program should be able and ready to pick and choose what can be shut down, either immediately or maybe very quickly, in order just for straight up environmental concerns, or just because like it sucks working there and no one actually wants to do it except for the fact that they need a paycheck. But once a paycheck stops being, you know, the driving factor behind work, yeah, there's a ton of crap you can just shut down immediately. And then the other stuff that, you know, you can't shut down, like for example, things like a lot of food production, like agriculture, and then power production and things like management of you know, public water utilities, like water infrastructure. These are all things that are, you could probably categorize as low mix, high volume production sites that you definitely don't want to just shut down. Those are the kind of things that need continuity. And so the things that need continuity, whether it's those or whether it's some kind of, you know, if there is, for example, some kind of like electronics manufacturing line that's for some whatever reason it needs to keep going. These are things that you now all of a sudden have way more people available to do them. And so you can immediately cut down on the amount of time people have to actually spend doing that stuff. I would think and hope that one of the first things undertaken is like technical training programs to get more and more people competent enough to contribute meaningfully to these very critical industrial and productive processes, to ensure their continuity for the sake of just like people not, you know, dying of starvation or dying of like, you know, have like swimming in their own shit all day or something because like the water doesn't work. But then also, you know, a lot of the kind of labor regime stratification stuff that we see now, this like the really just extreme like labor surveillance types technology and all these kind of things. You know, given that the profit motive has gone out the window, a lot of that just doesn't need to happen anymore. I would think that, you know, you could get rid of the whole, like, you know, you stay at your station for 8 hours and you just get a 15-minute break or whatever, that you can get rid of that. Like you can, you know, if people are like choosing to come participate in this because they understand it's like important for the continuity of society, and then there, you know, things like get access to food and shelter and all that is guaranteed just by like condition of the fact that they exist, then you know, people would probably just have a lot more fun doing this kind of stuff. And you know, you could probably gamify some of this stuff and just to make it like a blast to do it with your pals, and it's like a contest, like, haha, I created more utility units than you did, like I'm a better communist than you are. And I mean, I don't know how you know, ethically communist that is, but I think it'd be fun. So things like that. There's a lot that you can concretely reconfigure towards, you know, and to now, like I said earlier, to rationally account for all sorts of things that are like literally anything other than profit. And, you know, the joys of working in these processes would, in my opinion, be a pretty high priority, just because it's like, you want people to do them. It should be fun and not shitty to do it.
Yeah, you can definitely imagine like that. I guess it's a very old sort of avant-garde idea, but of like breaking down the division between, I guess, labor and production, but like the social experience of everyday life and work life. Like work could be a lot more fun to do. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I definitely see what you mean. Absolutely. And I agree. I think Lee, you might be next.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved your talk, and yeah, it makes me think about engineers, and like Andrew just chimed in the chat, there's sociological studies on engineers, and authoritarianism amongst them. I mean, it seems like one of the problems is that you have this class of technically skilled people, of engineers and people like that are used to being elite, and they like having this stratification of technical expertise, right, or however you put it. And it makes me think of like Lenin's. There's somewhere that Lenin talks about like these gentlemen. You know, it's very important to get like get these gentlemen on our side, the engineers and so forth. But it seems like in the Russian Revolution, that was also a problem. Like, in terms of really manifesting workers' power, because engineers were not necessarily didn't have a vested interest in that. Yeah, I mean, and maybe things would be really different now with like, there's a lot of you know, like makers, you know, hacker spaces and there's people who their social identity is all about being makers, and a lot of people are really into like gaining skills of all kinds, and so I don't know, maybe there's some opportunity for things being different. Anyway, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on any of that.
Oh yeah, loads of thoughts. I do have another piece in the rail. I actually forget the title of it because Paul came up with the title and I never remember what it is, but it's something about engineers. I should know, I wrote the damn thing, but I address a lot of that in there, but I can address what you just asked though, but first I kind of want to address the whole makerspace thing, just because this is it's a pedantic bone of mine I want to quibble. First off, makerspaces are great. I love them. I'm always stoked to see when people go and do and learn stuff there. And I think that, I mean, I'm toying with the idea of starting a bit of a communist makerspace myself, but which would be lit. But the thing is, doing stuff like in a makerspace is a whole different ballgame than being an engineer. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of another analogy. It's like being a professional athlete versus like being a really good athlete at your, you know, Sunday baseball league or whatever. It's a whole different mentality. Like having to actually manufacture things in any kind of volume, even like small volumes, like totally changes the way you approach technical production. But yeah, that being said, I love making shit. I mean, there's a very palpable kind of downward mobility inherent to being a millennial or a Gen Z kid. And engineers, we obviously make more money than most other workers. Like, it's just kind of obvious. But the thing is, even though our salaries are higher than other people's, it's still very cost of living is doing this, and our salaries are maybe just barely floating, or just in a lot of cases not even beating inflation. It's an open secret in most engineering disciplines that if you want to actually get good raises, you have to hop jobs. You can't just stick around. So I think a lot of people are very cognizant of the fact that they're getting fucked over by capitalism, whether they conceive of it in that term or not. They're starting to kind of grasp that viscerally, which is important. But also I mean, I live in a city where there's a lot of defense contract and defense manufacturing. I've had job offers for places to work at GA's killer drone department, and I turned them down because I was I wouldn't be able to live with myself. And a lot of other engineers feel the exact same way. They either refuse to work at places like that, or they get a job there and they go, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever, get me out of here. And so there is hope, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And I'm working on it. I'm working on getting, a bit of organization with these kind of people, but I'm just one dude. I'm trying my best, but
awesome.
Yeah, it's happening. Who's next in the stack?
Can people hear me? My audio working?
You're very quiet, but I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know if what I have to say is super relevant to this discussion, but I was just thinking about my own experience with work where it's mostly low volume stuff, but a lot of what I saw was management changing the actual structure of work to get workers involved in the actual management of the business itself. So sort of a capitalist form of self-management that they're actually encouraging and getting workers involved in. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. or if I need to get more specific about that. But it's something I experienced in multiple workplaces where they're sort of trying to downsize management and get workers to manage the business, the enterprise themselves to a certain extent. Of course, there's still a boss and everything, but they're getting workers more actively involved in the management of the actual business.
I think that's actually a really important point. My first instinct is always to, anyone who is waging the righteous jihad against middle management, I will ally with them in whatever popular front is necessary. But more seriously, that's a point I make in the essay, but not necessarily here in this talk, was that something very latent to high mix, low volume manufacturing is that you want, managers will actively encourage lower level technicians, at least if they're a good manager, they'll actively encourage lower level operators and technicians to get as much firsthand knowledge and experience and cross training as they can. And these people will kind of naturally get it just by virtue of how their work is and from having to like interact directly with people like engineers and stuff and higher level technicians. So getting workers to kind of take on a bit more like business administration stuff, whether that's like people management or like technical management, or like even keeping track of like, job like individual job finances or something like that. When I say job, I mean like work orders from like a client or whatever. That's kind of like a logical extension of this kind of imminent dynamic of people learning on the job from getting a high diversity of work tasks. Productive work tasks. And so that's something I see all the time too. I know if I can speculate, I'm sure that like nationally or maybe even internationally, there's probably a push to kind of just like eliminate a lot of middle management because it's such a big money sink for organizations. And I mean, a lot of middle managers are just kind of useless and don't actually like, I mean, in an organization that is like structured well, of course they can be useful, but in a lot of organizations, they're just not. I think Phil Neal was telling me how Haier, who is a Chinese, they manufacture a lot of different stuff, but they manufacture a lot of appliances. Apparently, they're doing this program where they're trying to get rid of a lot of middle management and replace them with from people who are from like the engineering ranks. And of course, engineering management's a whole different ballgame than actually being an engineer. But it's an interesting dynamic, and I'm wondering how if low profitability, how that's factoring into this is making organizations more lean, especially as we get more kind of reshoring and onshoring back to North America. And the name of the game is like cutting costs, and you're losing out on like the low wage labor of overseas, and so you have to really save on labor domestically. I think it's a good idea to keep an eye out to see how that trend kind of manifests in a specifically counter-revolutionary way. Because I think the revolutionary potential of such a dynamic is incredibly limited. But that's just kind of my speculation. I don't have any concrete examples to talk about there.
All right. Thanks again for talking about this. I read this a few weeks ago, and it really struck me then, and I'm reminded how good the piece is.
Thank you.
My first very, very small tangent, which is my first impression of your organizing issues, is it sounds a lot like academia. The issue being that profs and shit are being sort of more and more pushed to this informal work. And so maybe there can be some insight in some of their writings in your struggle. But my questions are pretty similar or simple. I was wondering if you'd spent a lot of time with Kropotkin, right? Both in fields, factories, and workshops, as well as in The Conquest of Bread. He dives a bit more into some of the more technical elements of communist production. And I was curious if you'd spend any time with that. And then, as we were talking about this again, a book by the bourgeois radical economist Thorsten Veblen came up. He had written about engineers as a revolutionary class in the United States.
The engineers and the price system.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
A very funny book if you've read that. But I was just curious what your thoughts were.
So for Kropotkin, I haven't engaged in too much detail. I will say that when I was a baby, brand new leftist, I think the first piece of theory I ever read after the Communist Manifesto was probably The Conquest of Bread. And I remember being kind of like, I was the kind of person who, I was very skeptical. I was like, well, communism or anarchism or whatever, this all sounds great. Like, it sounds really cool. I just don't think it's really possible. And then seeing Kropotkin lay out how, a bajillion years ago, it like totally was already possible back then from a technical level, and knowing how much technical advancement has happened since then, that was a very important moment for me in realizing, oh, this is not only like desirable, but it's also very possible today, and not just possible, but necessary. But besides that, I really have not engaged with much Kropotkin. I don't remember details. I remember there were things that I disagreed with in there that prevented me from really diving further. I don't know. I had a kind of fork in the road where I kind of stopped going down the kind of anarchist literary path and stuck to Marxism more. But, I often come across anarchists very much worth engaging with, who have some very good ideas, who maybe arrive at them from a different angle than I would arrive at them, but nevertheless are good food for thought. So if there's any good Kropotkin you think I could read, then you should hit me up and let me know. But as far as Veblen, a friend of mine recently recommended Veblen to me. I had never heard of Veblen before. I read 2 shorter pieces that were pretty cool, and I forget the names of them. But then Engineers in the Price System is one that it's on my reading list. It's in the big pile that I need to get to, but it's on my radar for sure.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Nick. I was curious, and this is, a question for Nick, but also for everyone else, I think, which is, there seemed to be sort of, I think in one of the other readings that we had for today, there was like the statement from the IKD about the Johnson Forest tendency. I think I'm not super familiar with all of that history so much, but it seemed like one of the questions that came up was like, there was, maybe the claim that there were certain, and this is like, generally speaking, I think you see this claim in sort of revolutionary conditions where it's like, there's one group that's trying to do too much, or they're trying to go too far. And the way that we characterize what too far or too much means is when they come up against the technical expertise of reproducing the world as it exists without like having a whole bunch of people die. And I feel like that's something that you've talked about, Nick, and I'm curious, what like when people are like, well, what about the engineers? Or like, how do we, like, the people that know how to do stuff are not going to listen to us if we appear radical or whatever. Like, it seems like that is a point at which there's debate, or a point that, like, those debates usually go back and forth around one position being too extreme or another position being reactionary and counter-revolutionary. So I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on those, like, just generally speaking, when people come up with those types of, when people are framing the debates in those ways about what to do or how things should go, if you have any particular thoughts about that from your position as an engineer.
Absolutely. I think it's important that for any revolutionary movement, there be broad participation from people in the kind of technical stratum, not just engineers, but also people who are kind of what we would call like lower level operators or lower level technicians in a productive site. Both are necessary. But what's the impetus for engineers to participate, given the kind of historically reactionary position that engineers have tended to occupy, both kind of socioeconomically as individuals, but also like structurally as in production. And I think that what we have now is this kind of like a weird historical juncture where the kind of so like personally, I have this hypothesis I'm chewing on that the route to an individual's radicality is not necessarily abjection, but like the active process of dispossession. So we're all obviously dispossessed from the means of agricultural subsistence. None of us are peasants anymore. None of us have that kind of radicality inherent to being shunted off the land and forced into the factory. But a lot of us have the kind of experience of dispossession, of decreasingly getting access to market mediated goods that we need for maybe not necessarily survival. I mean, living in the global north, I'm sure most of us are in no threat of starvation or anything, but like, we're in the promise of like the white picket fence and the nuclear family and the golden retriever and all that kind of stuff is decreasingly accessible to even a lot of engineers, just given like the absurd like skyrocketing housing prices, and just, you know, the fact that consumer goods after the pandemic are like increasing by 50% every year. And, you know, gas in California was like $7 a gallon, you know, a couple of weeks ago. And like all this stuff is like, sure, we're not like in danger of immediately dying or anything, but for engineers, the fact that this is palpable even for engineers, and it's like weighing on like the consciousness of a lot of younger engineers, like, can I live as good as my parents did? And the answer sometimes is frankly just no, you can't. So I think that we're at an interesting historical juncture where even the kind of traditionally reactionary forces of technical expertise are more amenable than maybe at any point in the last century to this kind of radical idea of wanting to restructure things. And also, I mean, if you ask a lot of engineers, you know, could society be structured better from a technical standpoint? I'm sure most will tell you yes. Some of that is just like some of that is just like dumb scientism. And you know, that's maybe well-intentioned, but just idiotic. But a lot of it also is, you know, we have a very like Byzantine bureaucratized society, both in the corporate world as well as the kind of just the way the state operates. And there's just a kind of palpable irrationality around all of us that's just like very plainly obvious from, you know, watching just all the garbage on TV or seeing the shit show of, you know, electoral politics, or like going to work and having to basically live out like, you know, the Office Space movie like every day. And so I think a lot of people are just kind of aware how just dumb things are. And engineers, I think, are kind of in a special position where we're, you know, we have technical expertise and we want to see society not run just in the most stupid way possible. And so I think that that's an angle that can be used to rhetorically recruit a lot of engineers. And it's something that's kind of working okay for me in my efforts. But, you know, it's a lot of it's just gonna be culturally and contextually dependent.
Well, that's really fascinating.
Nick,
Let's take Phil and Fidel, and then maybe we'll cut it off there since we are over time.
I have a question about your profession. In the 30s, mechanical engineers were the kind of culture heroes and stars. You had books like Mechanization Takes Command. You had every Ivy League school would start an engineering school. But there appears to be a moment where that disappeared from at least the mainstream culture, and suddenly the programmer became the hero and people would start computer centers or other kind of schools. Does that reflect just the invisibilizing of production? Or are the jobs for mechanical engineering now mostly outside of the US? Have they followed the kind of track of factories to low wage areas? What does the profession look like now in terms of jobs in the US or outside it? I'm just curious.
That's a phenomenal question. So a lot to unpack there. I'll try and make it quick. So part of it is, yes, production is a lot more invisibilized. I think that's an extremely good point. Like production is, I'm working on another essay right now about like kind of the black box of production, how production is just invisible for most people. You only ever encounter production on like the store shelf when the good's already been made. And so that's part of it. But also I think just because a lot of new and exciting technology is not, you know, it's all in the realm of not even just like electronics, because like analog electronics had their day in like, you know, the forefront of public tinkering. But like now, you know, software is kind of the deepest frontier of new technological innovation that's visible, because all the really crazy stuff being innovated in the realm of mechanical and electrical and chemical engineering is very, very advanced and just beyond the realm of what people can tinker with in their garage. Whereas if you have a computer, you can tinker with software. I mean, I do a lot of coding just for fun, just for little projects that aren't related to work. And so it's helped me in my job incidentally, but it's not like what I do for a living. As far as whether mechanical engineering has been outsourced or not, a lot of manufacturing engineering, which in a lot of ways in many cases is a subset of mechanical engineering, have been outsourced just by virtue of the fact that we have a lot of manufacturing lines in China or you know, Latin America or the Caribbean or whatever, or other parts of Asia. So you'll find a lot of manufacturing engineers wherever there are manufacturing lines, and those manufacturing engineers will often be people who are born and raised in those countries. But the United States still has a ton of mechanical engineers. So, all the mechanical design of stuff, which is never stopped being important. I'm a mechanical design engineer. I design items that then have to be they have to meet their functional requirements and then actually be like manufacturable. So that's something that is still largely concentrated in the US for US based companies. Same thing with like electrical engineers and stuff. Chemical engineers are a little different. Civil engineering is very different. The way that they operate is a whole different ballgame. But yeah, I think the big part of it is just that like all the exciting technological innovation right now that is like publicly accessible is all in the software realm. I have a tongue-in-cheek hot take I like to share, which is that mechanical engineering is the most materialist of the engineering disciplines, and I have a somewhat of a bone to pick with software engineers. It's friendly ribbing, of course, but the fact that they deal very much in the realm of abstraction and stay in the realm of abstraction mostly without having to worry too much about the concrete like material substrate of their work medium. Means you have a lot of people, whenever you get a lot of software engineers who are communists have a very much a mentality of what I like to call they want to just get the society machine and run industrial production.exe on it, but like change the value, change the little flag from capitalism to communism. It's of course I'm failing to give credit to a lot of very smart people, but it's a tendency I've noticed that is unfortunate. Especially because software engineering communists seem to outnumber mechanical engineering communists for reasons that are very long and detailed. I don't have time to get into now, but mechanical engineering very much has this kind of latent materialist ethos of like, you're constantly confronted with the way that your abstractions map onto the concrete material, form that your abstractions must take in order to actually work and for you to accomplish your goal. So there's that element to it too.
One last comment from Fidel, and then I think we'll close for today.
Okay, I just wanted, if anyone who didn't get to talk or ask a question wants to go ahead instead of me, I'm happy to relinquish.
Yeah,
Mike,
anybody having a question,
last
maybe a
chance.
little bit.
All right, I'll go. So yeah, I was just curious, this discussion of what organizing among the sort of engineer and mechanical and technical specialist cast or whatever is like in your experience, Nick. Like, and I guess I'm curious whether you intersected and have like a take that you can share with us about like the Tech Workers Coalition, which I know some people involved in, and I, from a 50-foot view, sort of watched some of their trajectory and travails. Like it seemed like it started with kind of anarchist and communist people and got taken over by kind of as a DSA project. And I don't really know the state of it now, but I was curious if that showed up on your radar, if you were involved or had observations, and yeah, just that.
Good question. As far as the Tech Workers Coalition specifically, I mean, they were on my radar, but I never engaged with them specifically because they never came across as more than, kind of, Kyle, were you the one that called them Brethren of Bernard, or was that someone else? That might have been Sean who called them that.
That was not me. That was not me. That sounds like a Sean thing though.
I think that was Sean who said that, but yeah, and so I don't know much about them just because I've just never really been that interested in them. I'm sure that I honestly probably should engage with them just because like, yeah, there's probably something I can gain out of it, but I just haven't. But as far as what like organizing looks like, so it's tricky because when people think of tech workers and when people think of like just the technical stratum of workers, the invisibility of production, as we talked about earlier, is very much occludes the position of like actual, traditional engineering disciplines. When people think of tech workers, like I'll tell people I'm an engineer, and then the conversation will just get increasingly confusing because they just never stop to think that I might be something other than a software engineer. And which is so odd and alien to me because it's like, well, duh, like how else do you think all this stuff gets made? But like, the fact that, so when a lot of this organizing going on in Silicon Valley, and this may sound like I'm knocking it, but I'm not. Any kind of like shop floor organizing people are doing is great, and I'm happy for it. But it's very culturally specific to Silicon Valley. I feel like the way that software engineering works in Silicon Valley is very, very, not very, very different, but it's quite different than how software engineering works for the majority of, descript, like non-flashy kind of workplaces in, not just the US, but the world. So a lot of the organizing that's happening in that kind of space is very, it takes a form that just would never work like at my kind of workplace, or like the place of any kind of low key sort of place that hires software engineers or any other kind of engineers. And just because it's based around kind of like a lot of PR concerns and stuff. And, if I started a union and our big ask was to get my company to better recognize like LGBT issues, they'd be like, what? Like it wouldn't track. It wouldn't be, even if we had LGBT people working there, which I mean, in my workplace we do, but like, it's not something that like, my company that I work at doesn't have like a big PR presence they need to maintain the way like Google does or whatever. And so organizing around like PR stuff is just kind of a dead end for most technical workers. There are a lot of, in the software realm, I think people are getting a lot of success or they're starting to get success with organizing in more kind of traditional shop floor stuff, as maybe kind of either a parallel or partially like an outgrowth of this kind of Silicon Valley software engineer organizing kind of stuff that you see. But in the kind of engineering I do, which is like a whole different world than all that, like very, very little intersection with that. There's like nothing there, at least that I know of. It's you'll have sometimes like very tiny little like confrontations with like management where like a couple of people are able to band together and like get like a very small concession. But I mean, that happened in my, like, I saw that happen once as I was getting hired somewhere. And it was, the people who did that like had zero conception of what they were doing as like class struggle or anything. It was just like purely like, hey, we want more money. And so there's like really nothing. That's why like I have my organization that I have outside of my workplace that is going, decent as far as recruiting people who are maybe interested in this kind of stuff intellectually, but I haven't really been able to make any kind of jump into like shop floor organizing. It's just something that you're not really gonna see much of right now, but it could change. It's just, there's a lot that has to change first before that starts becoming a more and more viable option.
It sounds like one of the takeaways is that maybe what I'm hearing from you is that there would need to be more sort of specialized or segmented organizing before there would be much to talk about in a large, like, kind of generic tech worker context, both because the kinds of work, but also like the work situations of people or the contexts. Yeah.
We just don't have that kind of like proletarian self-activity going on yet. I think in a way, like seeing people like Amazon, warehouse workers or Starbucks workers unionize, obviously they're whole different type of lived experience than, a cushy engineering job. But I think just like having this kind of idea of organizing in your workplace being normalized, even though I'm not optimistic about unions, I don't think they're a good revolutionary vehicle, of course, but like just having that be normalized among people of our generation. I mean, like my generation, I guess I could say, that can't be a bad thing. I think it's only a matter of time till it starts to spill over. But unfortunately, I feel like people in my profession, it might be one of the last kind of groups to take on more like self-directed militancy in the workplace, unfortunately. But I'd love to be wrong.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. I think you are brilliant, and I am incredibly grateful for you and your work, which is an inspiration. And I just, and the level of this group the level of conversation in this group is so high, and the presentations we've had have all been so amazing. And I'm just really grateful for all of you.
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity to come on and talk about it. It was a lot of fun. It's good to meet people who don't think I'm some kind of weirdo crank for talking about this stuff.
Not at all. I think you can tell by the how much the chat channel was so on fire today. I think everybody's really excited, and even if there's some people who are quiet, it seems a lot of interest. So thank you. Let's stay in touch, everyone.
Absolutely. I do have if people want to read more stuff I've written, obviously I have my pieces in the Rail, but I also have a blog that I maintain. I put some shorter pieces on there usually called Design for Manufacture, to play on words. So
Great.
if you're itching more for more stuff like this, you can find more there.
Can you put
And
the link
we'll-
in the chat before we
Oh
end?
yeah, duh. We have the
Well,
technology.
Also-
Let me do that.
Does
put the
anyone have the
links-
chat from last week? I wonder if it's okay to save the chats, because they're, if nothing else, kind of repositories of some of the links that get shared. I don't know if anyone saved, or not last week, but last month.
I have the chat saved. I can maybe put them together if they
Cool.
have some good links. But we can also I'll link your blog in the show notes, or in the YouTube video notes below, if that's cool with you.
I think
Thank you,
people
yes, I
sort of
appreciate
assume
that.
that the chats won't be distributed, so I think you could send like some, yeah, I don't know. See, I feel uncomfortable about that because I feel like it's gonna disappear. And sometimes
Just links, like if there were links to
Yeah,
pieces,
links
or like extra
to-
readings or whatever.
yeah.
Well,
Cool.
thanks, Nick. Thank you, Jasper. Thanks, Phil and Kyle.